It's a great honor to have our next guest speaker, Mr. Malcolm Hoenlein. Mr. Hoenlein is the CEO and Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of the major American Jewish organizations. The conference is the central coordinating body on international and national concerns for 51 national Jewish organizations in the United States. The Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organization Fund advances the interests of the American Jewish community, sustains broad-based support for Israel, and addresses the critical concerns facing world Jewry. In the recent years, the conference is at the forefront, mobilizing support to halt Iran's nuclear program and to counter the global campaign to delegitimize Israel and the Jewish people. Mr. Hoenlein received his BA in Practical Science from Temple University and completed his master's degree and doctoral course at the University of Pennsylvania. A National Defense Fellow in the University Near East Center, Mr. Hoenlein taught international relations in the Political Science Department and served as a Middle East specialist at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Mr. Hoenlein has traveled across the globe, meeting with top world leaders and heads of Jewish communities. He was appointed by 3 presidents as a U.S. delegate to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and participated in several presidential delegations. Mr. Hoenlein has written and lectured across the U.S. and abroad. He serves as an advisor to many public officials and is frequently consulted on public policy issues. He appears regularly in the media and co-hosts radio show and does weekly commentary and another radio show. Mr. Hoenlein is associated with and serves on the boards of many communal, educational, and civic organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations and Council for a Secure America. He is the chairman of America's Voice and co-chair of the Secure Community Network. He also serves on the board of high-tech, pharma, and other companies. Mr. Hoenlein has been recipient of many awards and tributes and received numerous recognitions from foreign governments, including the highest civilian decoration from the King Muhammad in Morocco, Jerusalem City highest tribute, Ne'eman Yerushalayim, Trustee of Jerusalem Award, and the Defender of Jerusalem Award from Israeli Prime Minister Shamir. Mr. Hoenlein will discuss what are the changing international challenges for Israel. Please.
I'm not high tech, I don't use computers and things. I hardly can read my writing when I come. So I will try to share with you some views about the changing international challenges for Israel. But I know you've already heard from Itamar Rabinovich and from Ehud and from Yadlin about these things, 3 good friends and great experts. So, you know, it's like Elizabeth Taylor's 8th husband, you know what to do, you don't know how to make it interesting. So I will try to talk about what is really going on in the Middle East, because it isn't what we believe, and it isn't what we're being told. I've had the privilege in the last 2 years to visit almost all the Arab world, Arab countries that in the past didn't want to see us, and I was the last person to meet with Assad before the fighting broke out in Syria. So I have a unique perspective on a lot of what is going on. And as much as we think we know very little. And the media so often distorts the reality that you cannot really believe what you read, you can't believe what you hear, you can't even believe what you see. So many stories that have appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world are complete fictions. We've seen it repeatedly, you know, the story about the sharks that attacked off Sharm el-Sheikh, and the Egyptians were convinced that they were trained by the Mossad to destroy the tourism industry. Not to be outdone, the Saudis captured a vulture, which Israel had tagged to mark the migration patterns, convinced that it was a new kind of drone. They released Marvin about 2 weeks ago because they found out he's a bird. Not to be outdone, the Iranians executed 6 squirrels whom they were convinced were trained to infiltrate their nuclear program by the Mossad. You laugh, hundreds of millions of people believe it. Mark Twain once said, if you don't read a newspaper, you're ill-informed. If you read a newspaper, you're misinformed. And it is a dilemma that in an era when we have had the information revolution, when we have instant availability of all the information, how little we really know. It's one of the reasons why Judaism puts such emphasis on history. There is no Hebrew word for history. Zechira we use. But Zechira is not history. History is static. History is reporting on something that took place at a certain time. Zechira is dynamic. And it is imposed on us by all of our holidays. Our whole ritual calendar isn't meant just for those kind of observances. They're meant to be experiential, that we experience what previous generations went through. Zechira is the central concept in all of Jewish life. The great commandments were given in the context of Zechira. Remember the Exodus from Egypt. Remember the Sabbath. Remember. Because those who don't remember are doomed to put the onus on their children and their grandchildren. Winston Churchill once said, the further back you look, the further ahead you will see. Today, nobody looks back. Nobody has patience for history. Everybody wants everything now. We want peace instantly. We want food instantly. We want everything now. But that's not the way the world works, and it's the reason why we get such distorted images and impressions about what's really happening when it's not at all what's happening. We were promised in the 21st century a new world order, and what we've gotten is old world disorder, more like the 19th century than what the 21st century. We're seeing and reliving the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse after World War I and World War II of the international orders, happening right now. You know, they tell the story of a man on a scooter stopped at a light in the Negev next to a guy in a Lamborghini, and it said doctor on the license plate. And he pulls up and he puts up to the car and he says, Doc, that's a beautiful car. He said, yes, it cost me $250,000. It's a beautiful car. How fast does it go? He said, well, in a minute I can get it to 80, in 2 minutes 120, 2.5 minutes 150. It's a beautiful car. Can I look inside? And the doctor says, okay. And the old man leans over and he squirrels around looking at it, and the doc says, you know, when the light changes, I'm going to show him what this car can do. The light turns green, he takes off. And he sees the old man left behind, and all of a sudden, whoosh, the old man passes him. So he puts his foot on the accelerator and really floors it. Again takes off, sees the old man behind. A minute later, whoosh, the old man passes him. So he was really frustrated, and he floored it, and all of a sudden he looks back and he sees the old man again coming back, and he smashes into the back of the Lamborghini. The doctor jumps out and runs over to him and said, is there anything I can do for you? And he said, yes, could you untie my suspenders from your mirror? The rest of you will get it later, it takes time, it's so early. But it's sort of the way I feel the world is now. That we're being flung back by our suspenders into eras of the past where old isms that we thought had long been destroyed, had been relegated to the history of the 20th century, are now coming back. And coming back with a vengeance, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's recidivism, whether it's the divisions that are taking place in Europe and around the world. And these are going to pose serious challenges. And you, specifically you, can make a huge difference in this. And I say that based on studies and on information that we have about the important role you can play. Last week, today, I was at the African Union Summit in Equatorial Guinea, invited for the first time that a Jewish delegation was invited. And we had an amazing day of meetings on Wednesday with a dozen or more heads of state, countries who seek out Israel and Jews, who are so proud of their connections to a dozen different companies, whether in water, post-harvest reclamation, medicine, agriculture, whatever. But on the day of the conference itself, our delegation was seated in a prominent place, and we see that the conference doesn't begin. It was 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, didn't begin. And finally somebody called me out and he said, "They won't go in until you leave." I said, "Why? What did we do?" They say, "Well, we can't tell you to leave. We're not telling you to leave. We're telling you what the president said, the commission said, that they don't want to come in when there's a delegation of Israelis." And I told them that that was offensive enough, but the fact is that nobody in our delegation was Israelis. We were all Americans, Jews, but Americans. And I sent back a message, particularly to the Egyptian delegation who led the opposition, and joined by South Africans and others in order to press that we not be allowed to stay. And they came back and said, it didn't make a difference. And I said, that's exactly what I wanted to hear from you. That it's not because we were Israelis, it's because we were Jews. And they apologized and they were very sympathetic, many of them, and I believe that the host country and many others I know did not go along with the decision, were upset by the decision. But it's a reminder of what the BDS movement is about. It's a reminder of what Israel today and Jews today face in the world. That it's not because of 67, it's not because of occupation, it's because of 47, it's because of the existence of the state of Israel. That it's not politically correct to say I hate Jews 70 years after the Shoah, although increasingly you see politicians in Europe and political parties in Europe, a quarter of the European Parliament, who advocate such views and who express it by going after shechita or brit milah, circumcision and ritual slaughter, to ban them because they know that that's a roundabout way of attacking the Jews. But today they attack the corporate entity of the Jews, the collective Jew, the state of Israel. Not because it did anything wrong, but because it is. And frankly, because it does right. It's a support for democracy, it's for gay rights, women's rights, education, the liberal attitudes. That's the threat. And we see now who the real enemy is as you see the rise of these extremist forces, not just in the Middle East, but it starts in the Middle East and goes around the world. And so for 50 years, Israel fought the war of terrorism virtually alone. And now the whole world is facing it because they did not come to Israel's side. As long as it was Jews who were being slaughtered and Jews who were the victims, they were willing to turn a blind eye. And now we face ISIS, we face hundreds of Americans and Europeans fighting in Syria, something I went public about 2 years ago, trying to get the governments of Europe and my own government to pay attention to it. Now they can't handle the situation because you have thousands of people with American, European, Canadian, South American passports who came as young as and attracted by an Islamist ideology and are leaving as jihadist murderers. More than 800 that France acknowledges, and it's over 1,000. More than 400 in England. Half of what MI5 in Great Britain does today is to deal with the crimes and the threats posed by these people. Every country in Europe. And like all the other challenges, including ISIS, we could have stopped it. The problem is that they don't have the sense of zechira. They don't have the sense of history. The West lacks will and determination. Our enemies test us constantly. They probe, they look for the signs of weakness and exploit it. You know who said it? Osama bin Laden, Khania of Hamas, Khomeini, all use the same terms. It's because we fail to have this context that history gives us. So people ask, how come 20 years ago we already argued against the nuclear Iran or about the danger of Islamist fundamentalism? And I tell them it's not because we have more information than Scotland Yard or MI5. even though today that doesn't mean much. It's because we have Zechirah that enables you to see through the chaos and perceive the dangers. They are obvious. We could have stopped ISIS at Fallujah. We warned, we asked them, we begged them to do it. We could have stopped Iran's nuclear program without a single weapon, without having to have sanctions. We abandoned the people of Iran in the Green Revolution. We abandoned the people of Syria when they tried to carry out a revolution. We abandoned the people of Lebanon. And we backed the wrong parties in Egypt, in Libya, even in Morocco. And so today the West's credibility is nil. It's an era of such complexity. Everything is interrelated. All the issues, when I came to New York, I started the Soviet Jewry movement. You thought about this big issue of fighting Russia, a prison that spanned 2 continents, but you didn't have to think of the implications in Indonesia and Iran. Today, you have to look at every issue and its global ramifications and complications. Globalization wasn't just about economics, it was about politics. So everything today is interrelated, and you cannot take simplistic approaches as so often we see, and politicians tend to take them because it's easier, but it's not effective. We have to learn, and it is not enough for us to take a superficial approach. This is an age of superficiality. People don't have patience for history, they don't have patience for the facts. And we pay a heavy price for it. 70 years ago, people said they didn't know. We know from the release of the archives that the Allies knew every day how many Jews were being killed. But they didn't release it because they didn't want the Nazis to know they broke the codes. I asked the British ambassador, why didn't you release it at Nuremberg? Why did you wait 7 decades? Because they didn't want the lie exposed. It wasn't that they didn't know, they didn't want to know. You know that they recently found out that the Brits had captured a number of high-ranking Nazi officers and kept them in a mansion outside of London, and they were taped, everything. The trees were bugged, the bathrooms were bugged, everything. And they revealed incredible information about what was really going on in the Shoah. And Jewish refugees had to sit and transcribe those tapes. And everything was put under lock and key and only found by accident earlier this year. The New York Times revealed that all of a sudden we now know there are 42,000 work camps, labor camps, concentration camps in Europe. Could anybody not have known? We just published a book last month that documents the synagogues destroyed on Kristallnacht, a term invented by the Nazis to cover the brutality and reality of that night. We documented almost 1,400 synagogues, not 195 like the history books say. So as much as we think we know of events even in our own lifetimes and just before it, the fact is that we don't know. And people say today it is what it is. That's not true. It is what you make of it. It is how you respond. Martin Luther King said, we will not be judged by the attacks of our enemies, but by the silence of our friends. And the lesson of history is it's not what our enemies do, it's what we do. It's we who raise the bar on what we will tolerate. Jews in Germany kept saying, look, we can live with it. They cut us off from education, they cut them off from commerce, they cut them off from making a living. They kept saying, how much worse? Von Ribbentrop will never let him do it. Look at the headlines the day after Hitler got elected. The New York Times called him a Charlie Chaplin-esque figure and said they will never implement their racist ideology. And throughout history, we see the same pattern. We keep raising the bar. So people of conscience have to stand up once and for all. What we saw this week in Israel, what we see with the Boko Haram, the 300 girls, who in the world gives a damn about them? How is it that Christians can be massacred by the thousands from Indonesia to Iran to Iraq to Egypt to Nigeria, and nobody cares? How is it that Baha'i can be massacred in Iran, more executions under Rouhani than ever under Ahmadinejad, and the world doesn't care? Because the fact is that the world has learned no lessons in the past 70 years. But the hope is that we have. And you in particular, because you're people who have influence, you are people that others listen to. You come into contact with so many people. Our studies show that 50% of Americans say that they have a Jewish friend, acquaintance, or somebody they know who knows Israel. But they never mention Israel. Of those that do, the pro-Israel numbers go up 300%. I wish you could have heard the African leaders there saying, keep Europe, keep the United States, just give us Israel. So we think we know, but the fact is that we know very little. There is a lot of good news. I will talk about the other side in a minute. Israel is heading this year to energy independence, water independence. China opened a $300 million center in Beijing, a joint Israeli-Chinese center. The Prime Minister of India praises Israel and said this is going to be his most important relationship because when he was the governor of Gujarat, 2,000 farmers a year came to Israel. There was billions of dollars of investment that promulgated him into the prominence that enabled him to become the president of Iran, the Prime Minister of India. And we face enemies that are the opposite of us. People try to justify it. They try to cover it. They don't want to face reality because it's not convenient. We paid a heavy price for that 70 years ago. We paid it with Stalin. We stayed with all of them because they tell the truth. They tell us what they're going to do. We just don't listen. The leaders of ISIS, the leaders of Al-Qaeda, the leaders of Iran tell us what they want to do. They want to wipe Israel off the map, and they seek the means to do it. And we say, no, they don't mean it. They mean it. And they're seeking the means to do it. Dictators tell the truth. Leaders of democracies lie, but dictators tell the truth. They tell us what they're going to do. We just don't listen. And if you had a sense of history, people would be able to see it in the context of past experience and recognize that if you don't take it for the reality that it represents, then our children and grandchildren pay the price again. The BDS movement is not new. It's a resurrection of what we saw on Kristallnacht. It's a resurrection of such efforts throughout the ages. Who are they attacking? Hania, mother-in-law, came to Israel 2 weeks ago to be treated in the hospital. His granddaughter came to Israel to be treated in the hospital, and he shot 20 rockets last night to kill Israelis. Israel kills only to exist. They exist to kill. There is no moral equivalence. We're seeing the firefighter and the arsonist, the violator and the perpetrator and the victim, all being equated. We see no more distinctions by people who certainly should know better. So this is a time when all of us are going to be judged. Just as we judge a generation of 70 years ago and ask, what did they do? We will be judged for what we do or what we fail to do. The challenges that we face today are not challenges of months or years. They're going to be challenges of generations. What we have seen in the Middle East is not an Arab Spring. It has no relevance to an Arab Spring. It's an Arab volcano that will continue to erupt for a long time. This was never about democracy. I was in Egypt 2 days after the revolution, and I met the young people, and I was in Tahrir Square, and I met with the generals. This was about food and jobs. Food went up 100% in the first 3 months of the year. Oil, flour, basics. You remember it started in Tunisia when a guy's cart was taken away, and he immolated himself. So first and foremost, this was about jobs when 40%, now 50% of the people in Egypt make less than $2 a day. There's nothing that drives you into the street more than an empty stomach. And the Muslim Brotherhood was smart enough to manipulate it, to put themselves behind, but have the people out front that they knew on the television screens in the West would not scare them. Second, this is about failed states. Syria is not a real country. People do not have a Syrian identity. They're Alawites, they're Christians, they're Kurds, they're Huranis, they're Druze, they're Shiites, they're Sunnis, but they're not Syrians. Libyans are not Libyans. There are 147 tribes, often speaking different languages, with nothing really to bond them. That's why you need a dictator or a strong central party to lead it. When I met Assad just days before the fighting started, he said to me, if it ever comes here what's going on in Egypt, I will never step down because I will get out, but they will massacre the Alawites. And I told our president, this is the time you have to step in because he's not going to be Gaddafi and he's not going to be Mubarak. He's not going anywhere. We have to identify people now that we can work with. Unfortunately, the West chose not to. Fourth, this is about the information revolution with the computers which enabled us to communicate in ways that they couldn't before. But fifth, this is overall about the Sunni-Shiite battle for hegemony in the Middle East. And if you don't see that underlying everything that is happening, you will never understand anything that is going on in the Middle East. There are four empires competing for power. The Persian Empire, trying to reestablish the glory under Khomeini, and he says it. Erdogan wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. The Saudis backing a Wahhabi empire. And the Muslim Brotherhood succeeded in establishing one from Egypt to Morocco, winning every election, but thank God it's crumbling. And now you have ISIS, establishing the caliphate. When you look at Syria, and people present it as a fight between Assad and rebels, it isn't true. It's an onion, and you have to take every layer. That this is about Russia versus the United States, it's Iran versus Turkey, it's Saudi Arabia versus Qatar, it's Christian Sunni versus Shiite, it's Christians versus the Kurds versus everybody. It's one layer after another, if you really want to understand what's happening. That's why I say that if you don't have the sense of history, that if you don't have a context in which to see this thing, we look at it, we had the chance to change Syria. When our ships were around Syria and we could have fired, we could have changed the whole situation. When they pulled the plug on that, we started the war in the Ukraine. Everything is interrelated. And Putin read it right, that the West was not going to do anything. So we are facing today a worldwide change. There is no country not affected by this. You know that in America, we are involved in a project to stop illicit cigarettes because Hezbollah makes $1 billion a year of the sale of illicit cigarettes just in the United States. Now they're into generic drugs in Europe and in the United States. We know that they're tied to organized crime, to narco-terrorism. We see the manifestations of all of this all over the world. We saw it in what African leaders told us about what was going on, how the weapons that are being smuggled in, how they're trying to undermine the regimes. And go to the Gulf and speak to the Saudis or the UAE or the Kuwaitis, who will tell you Israel is our only hope. We'll condemn them, but we pray for them. There is a revolution, because when you look at the four empires that I told you, when you look at what Turkey wants to do through Syria into Iraq to the Gulf, what Iran wants to do through Syria, through Iraq to the Gulf, through Jordan, what the Wahhabis want to do coming the other way, and what the Muslim Brotherhood is doing, there's one little thing blocking them, whose name hardly fits on the map. That's the threat that Israel represents. That there's an outpost of democracy that the people can look to and say, that's what we want, and counters the threat. And now Arab countries, Arab leaders who don't have relations with Israel, but come to us because it's a way of having an indirect relationship, talk to us about the dangers that they perceive we have so many challenges. What we have seen is that the big lie still works when it comes to Jews. We see in Europe the efforts to demonize Jews, the extraordinary rise in anti-Semitic attacks, especially in France, the radicalization of populations, the consequence of which we have hardly even begun to realize. Do you know when the Médecins Sans Frontières called me one night at home from Syria, and they said, you know, we've seen this sudden influx of people from Syria. And I said, well, why are they coming? And they said, we interviewed them, and they said they're Mohammed Marra fighters. Mohammed Marra was the Muslim young man who killed 3 little children in Toulouse. They are Mohammed Marra fighters. That becomes the ideal, that becomes the leadership, that becomes the model for them. And it's why we, all of us who care, and you who work so hard to save human life, have to do more, have to take a lead in making sure that the truth gets out. It's our strongest weapon. Look at Israel, study Israel. Israel's not Disneyland. It's not perfect. Sometimes it's Neverland, but it's not Disneyland. But it can stand against any other country. We cannot allow, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, reverting back to the old isms. We will not have a cloak of ignorance to hide our shame as they tried 70 years ago. People have the ability to opt out. You have the right to opt out. But you better have good answers for your grandchildren. Because you know everything today. We know the nature of the challenges that confront us. We see how much good can be done. We see how countries are now flocking to Israel because they recognize how much it has to offer. But we dare not allow it to be undermined. You know, there was a meeting in Jordan a year ago of ISESCO, the Islamic Society for blah, blah, blah. 42 countries came there to declare that the Western Wall was not the Western Wall, but named after al-Buraq, Muhammad's horse, who ascended after him, even though Muhammad never visited Palestine, Israel in his lifetime. That Rachel's tomb was really a mosque named for Muhammad's driver. And that the cave of Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, is really just a mosque and not a Jewish, and there should be no Jewish synagogue there. Do you know that today, if you look at UNESCO documents, it says Western Wall / al-Buraq's wall. It says Rachel's tomb, which for 30,000 years was called Kutab Rachel. No one ever imagined anything about a mosque. And you'd say to yourself, with all of the problems that the Middle East has, why would they invest in this? Why does Abbas follow Arafat's lead to deny the existence of the temples, which goes against Christianity and against Judaism? When all the archaeological discoveries substantiated, every shovel in the ground for this light railroad uncovers our past. It makes the Bible a GPS in Jerusalem. The answer is they know if they take away our past, they take away our future. That if they cut us off from history, if they cut off our roots, our right to be here, what right do we have to be here in the future? There's only one country in the UN whose credentials are challenged every year. Not Palau, not little islands, when the next tsunami comes, it's going to be gone. Only one. The one that has 3,000 years of history, the only one where the people speak the same language, have the same religion, celebrate the same holidays as their ancestors 3,000 years ago. Sanctified by generations of blood, sweat, and tears. 25 resolutions passed by the General Assemblies here, 21 against Israel. 7 in the Human Rights Council, not dealing with the executions in Iran, not dealing with 180,000 dead in Syria, not dealing with the killing of Christians in Egypt. All of them dealing with Israel. It's time for all of us, all good-meaning people, Jews and non-Jews alike, because all of us will pay the price. Israel is in the forefront. I'm frankly tired of memorials to dead Jews. I don't want any more. I don't want any more museums touting past generations that were massacred. We have no more cheeks to turn. It's time for us to stand up and demand of the world, not that they memorialize dead Jews, but they stand up for a viable Jewish state, a living Jewish state, and a living Jewish people. And that they declare in the United Nations and in every forum that anti-Semitism will not be tolerated, that we will hold everyone to account, whether it comes at the African Union or in the legislatures of Europe. It's time to draw the line. They, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, are all reading the tea leaves. They see the failure, that there is nothing for which we stand, and particularly, unfortunately, the disengagement of the United States. Throughout the ages, from the Romans till the Nazis, when they wanted to degrade the Jews, they used to march and yell, Hep, Hep, H-E-P, Jerusalem et perdita, Jerusalem is lost. Because there was nothing that was more degrading, that was seen as more of an insult for the Jews than the fact that they were not in their eternal city. Now we're back and we take it for granted. It is imperative that everyone who cares about democracy, about freedom, about human rights, about life, stand up today, declare the realities to the world, and say, we will not take it anymore. We will not raise the bar. We will not tolerate. We don't want to be any more the canaries in the mine. We're tired of being the barometers for the conscience of mankind. It's time for the world to say no more. The difference from 70 years ago is not that the world has changed, but that we have changed and that we have a Jewish state with a Jewish army. And that Jewish communities that would have been written off to history, from Syria to Ethiopia to Iran to Iraq, let alone Russia, would have been lost if we didn't have a Jewish state. We have seen the prophetic vision of the ingathering of the exiles. How many of us appreciate it? How many of us appreciate the miracles that our generation witnessed, that our grandparents and their grandparents would have given anything to see even one of them? And we take them for granted. You know, I tell Christian audiences that when Moses sent the 10 spies who came back with negative reports, and the 2 came back with a positive report, who of you can name the 10? And 5,000 people remained silent. I said, who can name the 2 who came back with a positive report? And 4,999 people were on their chairs yelling, Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb. And I said, that's the lesson of history. Those who stand with Israel are remembered forever. Those who go against Israel are written off to history. We are at that point today. I hardly began to go through all of the challenges that I wanted to talk about. But I think that there are bigger messages, and especially after the events of this week, that require all of us to think about what it is that we will do, what each of us can do, how we foster the spirit of unity that Israel has witnessed this week. The one precondition for every miracle that happened to the Jewish people throughout our history was unity. When we stood at Mount Sinai, Kish Echad B'Lev Echad, as one person with one heart, to the rescue of Russian Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Syrian Jews, to creating the miracles of Israel, was only when we could put aside our differences. But it's not just within the Jewish community, it's within all of humanity. It's a time when we have to come together against the scourge of terrorism, of these brutal, inhumane killers. We need you, all of you, each of you. Not everybody can do everything, but everybody can do something. If never again is to have meaning, it's not as a hollow shout at rallies, but as a pledge that each generation renews, that each of us does, together with our children and for our children, to say that we will never be silent, no matter who the victim, because once a world is indifferent to one, they are indifferent to all. That we will stand up and protect Israel, that it will never be alone in the world, not in the world community, not international fora. Whatever it takes, we will be there for them. Warren Buffett said that if you're looking for oil and gas, skip Israel. If you're looking for creativity, integrity, and honesty, it's your only stop. He was wrong. Now Israel has oil and gas. It is a model to the world. Tell anybody Israel's the size of Connecticut, they think you're crazy. It's a world power. But we can't take it for granted. We are here today with the opportunity, a unique opportunity, to make a difference. Wherever you come from, whatever country you come from, whatever your beliefs, whatever your religion, it doesn't matter. This is a common bond between us. We learned the lessons of the past. We'll be responsible to the future. You know, they say the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that the optimist says this is the best of all possible worlds, and a pessimist agrees. I don't tell you that this to be optimistic or pessimistic. We have to realize the miracles and share it with our young people, to show them what Israel has accomplished against all odds. I believe then we can all be optimistic about the future if we learn the lessons of history, understand our responsibilities to our grandparents and to our grandchildren, to understand this unique moment in history when all of the fundamental values we cherish are being challenged. But when it meets a unified opposition of all people of goodwill, we will overcome. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes for question if there are.
Please
I'd rather
approach
get
the
answers.
microphones. Please approach the microphone.
I'll just tell you that, you know, they used to tell stories about Senator Hoenlein, who was from rural Alabama. He was famous because he was on the Clinton impeachment committee. And he told the story of Notai Hawkins, who was a country lawyer, invited one time to the Bar Association in Atlanta. And he snuck out at night after his wife fell asleep, and he became inebriated, which means drunk, and he tried to fumble his way back into the room to be undetected, and he finally got the door open, and he's tiptoeing in, and he fell, and the lamp came down crushing over him, and his wife came out of the bedroom, a rather large woman, and glaring at him said, "What do you have to say for yourself?" He said, "I have no prepared text, but I'm ready to take questions from the floor." So we'll take questions.
Mr. Hoenlein, thank you very much for the excellent talk. My question to you, earlier you mentioned Prime Minister Churchill, and Churchill also said that history will be good to him because he's going to write it himself. My question is to you, what line in the pages of history, what paragraph that you're going to write, you and your friend, by yourself, which therefore will be written about you, that my children, my grandchildren, and their children will feel safe and live safe in Israel?
It's a very powerful question, and not one that lends itself to an easy answer, because I have not written, I've written a lot of things, but I never wrote a book, even though I have several contracts pending for it. Because I always tell them, what am I going to do the day after it's published? Because if I tell the truth, a lot of people are going to be very unhappy. I've known every president, I've worked with them, I've worked with most world leaders over the last 40 years, and certainly the leaders of Israel. I've had very intimate views of what they do and what they don't do, and have had a relationship of trust with them, which I do not want to violate. I did all of this for all these years because I care about the Jewish people and the Jewish state. I think history will judge me, you know, but the message that I do want to communicate, and what I started to write about, is the importance of history. This generation, when you talk to them today about the Holocaust, they don't want to hear it. Even good young people. They tell us, don't tell us about history. Talk about the future. But you can't separate the future from the past. then you're doomed to repeat it. Santayana said it, that was so many leaders, so many people have done it in their own words. Orwell said it, whoever controls the past controls the future, etc. But there's a reason why they all said it. And if I convey a message to my children and my grandchildren, it is about that you need the context, the perspective. It's why they don't see it. Can't tell you how many times I met with presidents of the United States, with secretaries of state, and I say, listen, look at this issue. And they look at you like you're crazy, that they don't know what you're talking about. That's the most frustrating thing. It's one thing if they don't want to do anything about it. When they took the aircraft carrier out of the Persian Gulf, and I went to the White House and I said, why would you do this? And they said, it's sequestration, because of the budgetary problems. I said, do you think in Tehran they believe that's the reason? It's not what you think. It's what they think. How do they perceive it? Move it back now. If you want the threat of all options on the table, move it back. If you want the Saudis and the Gulfies, and Israel for that matter, to believe that you're serious, but we don't think about what is the implication. Tehran thinks we don't have the money to keep it there, if it's such a priority, or that we weren't serious about the military option. And it comes out of a lack of perspective and a lack of experience and a lack of sense of history, which is tragic because America's disengagement is going to take a toll, the Western disengagement, that will take a toll that it will take decades to undo. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's an expression that you may want to forget the past, but the past will never forget you.
Right.
And I really support what you're saying tremendously, and you've really inspired us. I want to know why. I mean, with the killings of the 3 Israeli youths, there was certainly news coverage, but with the finding of the dead Palestinian child, which is terrible, I heard much more intensive, vitriolic statements from the White House than I had heard the week before about the Jewish youths. And my very good friend, who's the director of presidential correspondence at the White House, Mike O'Neill, just unexpectedly quit today. And I'm wondering whether people of conscience are just walking away from the White House because the White House, at this point, shockingly to me, has just forgotten its moral base and is really and truly not interested in Israel or Jews. What do you think? Am I wrong?
Oh, I was waiting for the Jewish question where you raise your voice at the end and
Yeah.
that becomes a question. Well, I think that the statement speaks for itself and for yourself. I obviously have to work with the administrations. We were disappointed in the language that was used and the immediate reference to both sides before this tragic event of the killing of the youth, and we do not know who did it or how it happened, and I think people shouldn't rush to judgment, just as we don't in other cases. We should wait and see, but the world already has convicted the settlers and others for this act before they know the facts yet. I think you will see many more people leaving the administration for a variety of reasons, but the fact is, every president has his own style. And this president aggregates all the power. Bush delegated all the power, he aggregates it. And it's only him with a little circle around him. Not even the vice president or others really matter. It's all the president and the key decisions. You hardly ever see pictures of cabinet meetings. You hardly see some of the things that you usually see. And Bush, for instance, was always delegating and using the members of his cabinet to the fullest. Clinton was sort of in between. With Clinton, you could talk hours and hours and hours about an issue and not get to the bottom line. Bush didn't talk for hours, but he got to the bottom line. And President Obama has his own unique style. And it's our job, we have to adjust to it, and they're not going to adjust to us. And we have to learn to play the system whenever the rules change. But I think that history, the historians, may not judge this administration as well as people thought they would.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that frank answer.
Last question.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and inspiring speech and presentation. I also enjoy learning from history, and what some of what you spoke about reminded me of the situation in the Franklin Roosevelt White House and the role that Morgenthau and others had. Can you analogize where there may be opportunities in either this or the future White House related to the previous questioner's statements, where there might be possibilities to turn things around, if you will?
Turn things around with the administration?
This administration or the future, are there people that have someone like Morgenthau's influence or president's ear? Are there people that have Roosevelt's insight or wisdom or attitudes?
I think that a lot of people question his wisdom and
Of course.
some of his insights.
Well, there came a time of
You know that Morgenthau worked 12 years for Roosevelt. He never bought an apartment in Washington because he always expected to be fired the next day because he was Jewish.
Yeah.
And
Well, he denied it. He lived as though he developed his Jewishness later, as I understand it.
that is true. But I didn't mean his Jewishness. I meant Roosevelt's perception of his Jewishness. And I've spoken to his son about it, and who's a great Jew and a great guy. And the real history of that period, even about what happened with the war board, what happened when he threatened to resign, etc., you know, there are various versions of it, and I think we still are too close to know the final facts. So all the books about Lincoln that are being written, and right now we're learning about somebody who was president 150 years ago, 140 years ago. But you ask an important question, and I do believe that we have to learn from the examples and see to what degree they're applicable. One of the things I want to make clear is I do not believe President Obama is an anti-Semite. I don't believe he's anti-Israel. I don't believe any of those things. And I think people have to be very careful what language you use when talking about presidents or other leaders whose relationship with Israel is of vital importance as it is to the Jewish community in the States. And, you know, calling the president an anti-Semite legitimizes anti-Semitism. So that some guy in Kansas City say, listen, if the president of the United States is, why can't I go and shoot up a Jewish community center? And why shouldn't I hate Jews too? So I think we have to be very careful about how we relate to them. You know, I used to get calls from Jimmy Carter at home at night, and he used to say, you know, you really know this stuff in such detail. I said, Mr. President, when it comes to life and death, nothing is insignificant. He was not as bad as he was afterwards, and we'll have to see what President Obama will be after he's out of office. He's a very young man. He has a long life ahead of him. It will be very interesting, and interesting to see how history will judge him. We do have people, thank God, and you know that 72% of the American people in the last poll expressed support for Israel. It's an all-time high. But as broad as it is, that's how thin it is, and why we can't take it for granted, and why we are doing all sorts of programs, bringing key opinion holders, movie actors, others who talk to young people, old people. We had a guy here last week who represents 500,000 Hispanic churches in the world. He wrote me a letter, which I got here, and I just showed some ministers yesterday, extolling Israel, saying that he is so in love, he wants to chair my BDS committee now. He wants to do everything. The truth is that we don't expose Israel enough to enough people and tell people and talk to people about it. So what I was going to say about Washington, we have the most supportive Congress that we've ever had, despite the changes in Eric Cantor, which was a great loss because he was a great friend, a great Jew. But there's nothing that gets votes of 400-0 than Israel issues. Not motherhood, not apple pie, nothing gets 400-0 votes. So there is universal support for Israel today in the Congress, and it reflects the feelings of the American people, but we can't take it for granted, which means we have to work harder, and we also have to identify people in Washington with whom we can work, who have entree, who have the ear. Again, it's a different setup than we used to have. You used to have many Jewish members. There are members of the cabinet who are Jewish. But this government works in a different way. And it means that we have to, and I speak to people in the White House sometimes every day, every week certainly, we keep the lines of communication open. Sometimes we don't say the things that people want us to say in attacking because we have to look at this in the longer term. We can't afford to burn all the bridges, or we never can advocate for Israel or do the things that we have to do for the Jewish people. So I know it's easy to criticize and it's easy to attack us for what people perceive to be the facts. When they look into it, you'll find that the record, I think, of American Jewry over the years since Roosevelt has been pretty good, and that the Jewish community has become politically more astute. And I would say that the, quote, political power of the Jews is something that I believe you have to do much more humbly. I don't believe we should be in the headlines. I think that, real power is how you exercise it. Power is like a muscle. If you exercise it right, you build it up. If you abuse it, you destroy it. And so, to me, real power, and why I don't have a PR person, it's in what you do, the credibility that you establish, it's the legitimacy of the case, it's that people come to trust you and know that you're going to, even if you disagree with them, they know where you're coming from and that you know what you're talking about. I know it would satisfy people more to have constant confrontations. It's not what's going to serve the long-term and ultimate purposes of Israel and the Jewish people.
Thank you very much.